it would seem to be the right moment to take another look at Plumbago Capensis and all that. The subject is gardening, a pastime that occupies people everywhere, from Memphis to Minsk. But nowhere does it occupy them with more passion, even madness, than in England. Because gardening is the most English and the most egalitarian of pastimes, an Englishman is never more content than when he has his two hands sunk in the blessed dirt that is forever England. It is an obsession. The English in their gardens is a form of national service, or as someone described it, self-defense, against a better, prettier garden next door. They pick and hoe away in gardens great and gardens small, overcoming the hazards of greenfly and slug, delphinium blast and curlyworm, and spend over $1 billion a year for the pleasure of it. The tall do it. The short do it. Even men in prison stripes do it. And when a felon's not engaged in his employment, a policeman's engaged in his. London police stations are not sandbagged, they are geraniumed. These precincts are not given awards for efficiency or numbers of arrests. They are, honestly, graded for their gardens. Nary a village in England does not have a garden club or, more Tony, a horticultural society. And nary a villager does not know her Latin horticultural catechism.
But I like this Helichrysum sulphur light. I think that's it. Yes. What is the variety of that one? A penstemon. Yes.
They are garden proud beyond any rational behavior, opening them up to show them off, constantly checking each other out.
Very interesting border, isn't it? You know,
yes.
One who's checked out more than most is Lady Heald, Daphne to her friends. She was chairman of the National Garden Scheme for 30 years and owner of a garden in Surrey that's 1,000 years old.
So I couldn't have too many weeds in my garden, or otherwise everybody would say, well, she's got weeds, so why we can have weeds? So that I have to try and keep it as weed-free as I possibly can.
what is it about British people, Lady Heald, that this passion for gardening?
I think it's born in one. I know I inherited it from my father, who was a great gardener, and we had a lovely garden in Hertfordshire. And I think it's just an inheritance, you know, an inheritance of England.
If the inheritance thins out, if the thumbs lose their greenness, there's no shortage of help. This shop has more than 500 titles on gardening. Help for the damp garden and the dry garden. If you're still stumped after 4 editions on diseases and pests, take the 5th. Dangerous plants may be for the valiant few, but tomatoes are for everyone. Something to help the contented houseplant to survive, something to help the big game plant hunter in Nepal. But the true blue British gardener puts his faith in more than mere handbooks. His real trust lies in the 37 television and radio shows devoted to gardens, and the rock upon which his faith is founded, to which for 35 years he has turned for advice, is...
Gardener's Question Time, number 1504. Hello again, and welcome this week to the village of Ballinger near Great Missenden in Buckinghamshire. Our hosts are the members of the...
This panel collectively is a national heartthrob. Its presence in your town an answered prayer. Tonight, Gardener's Question Time is visiting the village of Ballinger in deepest Buckinghamshire.
Now, at Ballinger, we're fairly high up in the Chilterns. The soil is full of flints over a clay subsoil. Not easy gardening country, as you can imagine.
The villagers have been waiting 11 years for this to happen. Other places wait 25 years. Others will wait forever. And finally, after 11 years, Ballinger can ask the question that's been troubling it for decades.
I am advised to cut back Senecio laxifolius in April, but the subsequent show of bloom is disappointing. Is the advice sound?
Should Senecio laxifolius be cut back hard in April? Bill Sarbas, please.
No, I think with this variety, it's from New Zealand, like grey eye, the one that's most commonly planted, huge, yellow, daisy-like flowers. I think it's better to cut back, prune this year's growth, say in late July by a half, something like that, and then you'll get a much better show of flower the following year.
What do you want, Alan, of your Senecio laxifolius?
I wouldn't prune it at all. If I were going to prune it, I'd prune it late in the year, not in April. They are not plants which normally are pruned. This is really what worries.
And it's not just Ballinger that's waiting for the answer. The show has just about the highest ratings on British radio.
And I would just leave the beastly thing alone.
For 35 years, Gardener's Question Time has been churning out answers to such eternal questions as, why has my compost gone sour?
I would guess that it's waterlogged, which means there's too little air, both, I think. Have you got it in a low position in the garden? No. It's not. Well, I think what you should do then, if it's...
The producer and MC of Gardener's Question Time is Ken Ford. His office is awash with invitations to visit horticultural societies, many of them tearful, some even threatening.
We're still dealing with invitations going back to 1957, 58. Some counties are worse than others, but the average waiting at the moment is about 10 years.
The most familiar, most garden variety of all the British gardens is the suburban front garden. This patch of earth is sacred ground upon which weekly, even daily, the supplicants perform familiar rites. Determined to ward off the 1,001 natural shocks a garden is heir to.
At the present time, my enthusiasm is suffering from chafer grub, cabbage root fly, spinach blight, mosaic virus and wet rot. Not forgetting Harbury mildew. And I'm afraid to dig up my carrots.
You never know what you might find. Are you sure you've not forgotten anything before we start?
Woolly aphid.
Woolly aphids, yes.
Sometimes our program is a recital of disaster. We start off with slugs, work our way through blight and mould in nose and everything else, and you sometimes wonder why anybody bothers when you get to the end of it, but oh, it's all good stuff.
Our very passionate gardener is a bit nuts.
Gardening has its share of crank, shall we say. You've got, I could be crucified for saying it probably, but the organic gardening brigade is fairly vociferous. Yeah, it has its share of nuts. You've got people who write saying it's cruel to eat vegetables because they scream when you pull them out of the ground, this sort of thing. And you have people with various hypotheses about plants feeling, talking, you know, reacting. We were talking earlier on about the chap who believed in electricity for plants.
The man Ken Ford is talking about is Mr. Cecil Lewis of Pullipit in Cornwall. For nearly 50 years, he's been zapping his plants and trees with thousands of volts of electricity.
The little end panel there tells us what radiation there is emanating from certain of the plants that are on test.
His lab has that look of phase 1 of Dr. Frankenstein's experiments.
The panels that you see here are controlling the electricity flow that's going out into the garden and into the various plants and trees which we are researching.
He calls his work electroconvulsive research.
We inject electricity into the trees, much the same as is injected into a mental patient's brain, but a much different voltage, of course.
All designed, he says, to promote growth, and all highly secret. As for the plants, we thought something like this would happen. In fact, the plants just sit and take it quietly. If anything, a bit stunted. When you point out that giant redwoods seem to grow rather high, unassisted, he remains charmingly oblivious, just like a good English eccentric should. Front gardeners who achieve a degree of success without electricity tend to seek other challenges. Men like Mr. Coe of Suffolk. He got very pushy with this very sleek pheasant. His neighbor, Mr. Bannister, no less cocky, retaliated with a chicken. It's called Topiary, an ancient art of the Romans. Mr. Powell of Bristol plies his shears on more contemporary lines. Mr. Leach of Oxford will never forget the destroyer he served on, and neither will his neighbors. She sits in dry dock in front of his house. You've not had one too many if you think you spy a 20-foot rabbit in the garden of Mr. Vincent of Laycock in Wiltshire. It's merely one more facet of English gardening madness. Or perhaps the rabbit is Mr. Vincent's way of frightening off gnomes. Gnomes can be found in English gardens all over the realm, and once they establish themselves, they're very hard to get rid of. Gnomes and their related frogs, doves, sheep, and owls were part of the appeal when Mr. and Mrs. Sangster of Clacton-on-Sea bought their house. But after a while, it all became too much, so the Sangsters came to a decision.
We don't mind in the least. As a matter of fact, I'm pleased. I don't think anyone around here is sorry, really, that we're having it knocked down. You know, when we took it on, there was no understanding that we wouldn't touch it, so we pleased ourselves. I'm sorry, that's me. I do what I want, not what people want me to do. I believe in leading my own life. So there is to it, isn't it? We would like flowers.
Mrs. Sangster probably had something like this in mind. There are very few things that will drag a committed or committable gardener away from his garden. One of them is the annual Chelsea Flower Show in London, a celebration of nature that teases the soul of millions of Englishmen. The tent covers 3.5 acres of London turf. It covers the best of British gardens. The Chelsea Flower Show is a flower contest, something like the Miss Universe contest, but the rules are as impossible to follow as croquet. Various groups of men and women, each one unmistakably a flower judge, very casually stroll or totter about. They are not only looking for the perfect Rosa longicuspis or Gomphrena globosa, they're looking for, say, 100 perfect varieties of each. Vaguely, extremely vaguely, they award prizes.
I'm sure everybody does. I suppose, yes. That's unanimous.
A gold here, a silver gilt banksia there. And to more questionable shrubbery, a mere SGF, a silver gilt flora.
That looks like 3-5. 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 5. I think we're a party of 8. Yeah. So that silver gilt, so gold had 3 votes, silver gilt 5, so it didn't go to a silver gilt. Wrong.
The culmination of the flower show is not the awarding of the medals. No one seems to care much who wins. The big moment is when the bell is rung. One way the Chelsea Flower Show may differ from Miss Universe is, at the end you can take the contestants home for a price. Out in the streets of London, it looks like a raid of suburban guerrillas. In their camouflage of amaryllis, delphinium, rhododendron, azalea, and even here and there, the odd troops of Plumbago Capensis. And speaking of Plumbago Capensis, back in Ballinger, Miss P. Heap has a problem with hers.
How should I care for my Plumbago Capensis?
Is it doing well?
Yes.
Well, don't bother then.